For those of you who've never been here, this is the University of IFAS Range Cattle Research and Education Center. It sits on about 3,000 acres of property, of which 2/3 of that is improved pasture and forage that is also in experimental setups, and about 1,000 acres of it is still native woods. And when you were driving in, you would have seen that we burnt the parts of the left-hand side as you're coming through. The woods here are in nowhere near as good a condition as what you were seeing this morning. These ones have legacy effects, have oak encroachment, and are really overgrown. They haven't had fire or really good fire for a long time. But that's the Range Cattle Research Center. We also have soil scientists here, agronomists here, livestock, animal, especially cattle, beef experts here. And then you have me, and I'm the stepchild in here. I'm the wildlife ecologist, okay? And they've only had a wildlife ecologist here at the research center since 2014. What bird is this? Quail. Bobwhite quail. So so this is quail 101. So this is a bobwhite quail. All right. Are there males and females there? Yeah, there's both there. So we'll talk about that too. So they are sexually dimorphic birds, meaning that in this case, you can tell them by plumage. And while we're looking at them, what does that beak of that bird tell you about this bird? Just look at the beak. Is it thin, fine? Is it thick, heavy? Would this animal be eating really delicate foods, or could it actually deal with some structural, hard-working food as well? They're a pretty interesting bird. I find beak morphology in this quail pretty interesting because they're eating a lot of invertebrates right through to some pretty hard woody seeds, and they can consume them both. Have you looked at cardinals? You all know what a cardinal is, redbird. Do you think they have a really similar beak shape? They actually do, and they have a really similar diet too. It's across seeds and invertebrates. So bobwhite quail in this part of Florida have existed in flatwoods and other habitats. I'm going to get into that a little bit more. And they've been on the decline, and everybody knows that. And Jeff will talk a bit more about the decline, and I'll show you a graph in here too. Males and females are really easy to tell apart typically. All right. Males are black, white throat, white supercilium. I'm an ornithologist. What's a supercilium? It's an eyebrow. We all have them. We've got these nice white eyebrows across the top of the head. Crest, and the female's a little duller, and obviously got a buff-coloured throat patch and a buff-coloured supercilium and eyebrow. Who's never seen a quail in the wild? I know there was one. I was talking to one. So some people here have never seen a quail in the wild. That's pretty sad. I mean, this used to be a really common bird. We should be able to see these birds easily. And excuse me, they're very vocal and often very observable as well. Quail can actually be aged too, and as an ornithologist, we do these sorts of things. And if you're interested when you actually catch birds to actually know their age, and you're doing that, you can relatively easily. And we're going to talk a little bit about some feathers. And the reason we're talking about, I shouldn't walk away from here, the reason we're talking about age is Tyrone told us, how long do quail on average live? What was that? 8 months. Yeah. Do most of them reach reproductive maturity? No, they don't. And so if you're out there and you're actually catching quail, looking at quail, you probably don't want to actually get rid of juvenile quail or young quail out of the population at all, but it's also really interesting to understand what your overwinter survival of adult quail might be. So you're actually understanding what individuals survive from one year to the next and being able to tell that. And you can tell that with quail early in the following season after they've bred, or the next year basically. So quail have 10 primary feathers. They're their main flight feathers, okay? You can see them numbered there, 1 through 10. And across the top of those primary feathers is what we call primary coverts. All right? Does everybody know all of this? Feather morphology of a bird. Do all birds have 10 primary feathers? It's a good question. They don't. Okay, so some birds only have 9 primary coverts, and that's important if you're trying to sex other species, but this particular bird does. I'm going to show you an important part of understanding age in quail is these buff tips. And for me, these buff tips occur on the primary coverts, but they also exist on, I'm going to go back a bit, this feather known as the alula feather as well. And you'll see that actually is lighter in color as well. So these buff tips on feathers, they denote a young bird. And if you see those, you know you have a juvenile bird. And juvenile birds have a full set of feathers that have all grown at the same time. Their first year of life, they're all growing through at the same time. And so they all look really similar, but they go through a molt. Why do birds molt? Anybody understand why birds molt?
Are they growing?
Pardon?
They're growing.
They molt every year. Every quail adult that survives, or most bird species that are out there, will molt at least once a year. Some birds molt twice a year. But anybody understand why would you molt? Somebody said something up there. That's a good idea. Get rid of old feathers. Feathers wear. They get shorter. Your actual flight dynamics would change. So actually one reason could be to replace feathers so you're actually better at flying. Another reason is that if you molt before the breeding season, for instance, you may actually molt into a breeding plumage, and you've seen birds that change their plumage characteristics during time. And cardinal's one of them. It's going to get extremely red feathers. So this is a molt, and counting from the inside out, you'll see that this is actually the 7th primary feather is the last one that is currently being grown. I'm going to walk over there to point this out. This is the 8th. This is not dropped yet. So it's actually grown all of these. And if you can see briefly, these ones are typically darker. That's not always the case, but it's true for a lot of birds. It's the coloration. The feathers will be more like new, and these ones will be UV damaged and often a lot lighter. So knowing this primary molt pattern here, you can age this bird to days. Did you know that? So you could actually figure out how old this bird basically is. And we also know how much it's grown. It's about a third, maybe a quarter to a third long. And then you can refer to a table or an aging table that's been worked out generally for growth of quail. And this particular bird is 83 days old. And you can take this home and it's with you. If you ever catch quail and you want to look at them, you want to age them and understand, do I have an older adult? Do I have a young one here, a juvenile here? And they'll maintain those 9th and 10th primary feathers right through to the next year when you're potentially hunting. So this will give you age. We were over here, quarter grown, 7th primary, 83 days of age. Pretty easy to do. It's rough, but it's pretty good. So you can sex and age quail now. Easy to do. And it's stopped. Here we go. Just to go over this real quickly, no buff tips, it's an adult. All right. And it could be still molting, but it's an adult. And this is a picture of an adult bird. All right. Well, actually, this is a picture of probably an adult bird that's molted through to its 8th. And this is worn feathers, and one of the reasons somebody suggested out there that you should actually molt. Other things are feather parasites that get into birds. A lot of birds have feather parasites. They eat away at these feathers and damage their ability to fly. So one of the reasons they may have evolved molting is to actually get rid of those parasites on feathers. That was a little bit of biology and ecology of the bird itself. The reproductive cycle, you should all, some of you may know, but bobwhite are pretty interesting. They have a really long reproductive cycle. And I stole this from Tall Timbers. I even gave him some credit over there. So a typical reproductive cycle of a quail, depending on where you start, let's start in breeding. So we're talking about right now, we're here. We have bob or males out calling, they're paired up, and even this year we've already found birds that are actually on nests and they have eggs. Is that true at Babcock, just by the way? Are they already on nests? Probably are. And this period here, where we're talking about this season of reproduction, is climate dependent in southern Florida especially. And this is true of many bird species in South Florida especially. I studied Florida stroke days, and I've studied burrowing owls, and we see shifts in reproduction in all of these species based on the weather variables that occurred during winter. This has been a really nice winter from my perspective. We haven't had lots of cold, we haven't had lots of freezes to kill off grasses, etc. We've had lots of rain to keep everything green. It's been maintained nice and warm. I suspect most of the adult population and younger moving into adult positions now are in really good condition. This is a good year. And I would expect now the nesting season, at least the beginning of this year, is going to be really good. And if we can maintain good rains and not get flooded out early, these sorts of things, you may actually have a really bumper crop of quail this year. There's lots of things that go into it, but that's typical of both quail, but other species as well. So they go through, and we've bred, we might have a number of broods. Tyrone said this morning up to 3 successful broods. Is that true? Or just 3 broods possible, and not all of them are successful? So they can multiple brood. Once they're all bred, and we've got through the summer, and there's a late breeding season here, around October, they go through the fall. It's often called the fall shuffle. It's been called that before. And they produce coveys or groups of birds that are not necessarily and typically quite often unrelated within the group. And those coveys vary in size, and they produce or form coveys for what reason? Anybody know? Protection. That's one good reason. Is it the only reason? More eyes, that's probably related to protection. Yeah. Or protection from what is a good question too. Anybody can answer here. Right, so we might have protection from predators. You could have protection from inclement weather. This bird species may not happen in Florida very often. This bird species is fairly far north, and having individuals that are together may help with thermoregulation, so they actually survive in cold in the winter. But also flocks of birds have been shown to actually feed more efficiently on poor resources. So if you've been in the forest and a group of, just let's say little brown dogs, little brown birds come through, and you might have a whole flock of them come through, and then you won't see any bird for an hour. Has anybody had that happen to them? Yeah. So there's a lot of activity and then it goes quiet. And they're not all the same species necessarily, but it's flock behavior. And they may be actually doing that because they're actually stirring up resources and food for each other. So if one quail's running to get something, and at the time it's moving, it's scaring at something else, and another quail's going to get there. Or you have a really good quail that can find food really well and everybody else is tagging along. I mean, if you're the dumb guy at the end, you just go and follow everybody else. I mean, there are things out there we don't know a lot about, but flock behavior is pretty interesting. But the time of year this happens and forming those coveys is probably a lot to do with escaping predators, especially avian predators in Florida. And here, right at that time of year, we have goshawks come through, Cooper hawks here. There's a lot of hawk activity. I don't know how much they impact the coveys myself. And so over winter survival is really important. and you can come through right the way round to the next breeding season. And we've talked about this a little bit before, 70–90% annual mortality, and with average survival just into the fall covey of being approximately one per 4 birds. We've talked about this already, and here's a classic picture of the cubby. Quail are ground nesters, which makes them available to just about everything out there. And so their placement of their nests is really important. Who's found quail nests in the wild? Hands up. A few people? They're actually hard to find. These guys cheat, don't you? Have you really found quail nests? You have? Without a radio tracker? Oh, good. I'm just making sure. And so, but for some of the science work to actually find them, it actually can be quite hard. You can follow quail building nests or laying eggs. And we found one the other day just because of the way the female was behaving. But they'll move back and they'll lay an egg a day. They might skip a day depending on how many resources that female has. And they can lay, I mean, if you look in the literature, it suggests 1 to 30 eggs, all right, in a single brood. I suspect the 30 egg brood might be 2 females laying in the same nest potentially. That's a lot. Yeah. But I do know we've got 14, 15, 16 eggs, probably pretty common. And that female has to, or male, they both incubate. They have to actually brood those eggs or incubate those eggs. That incubation period, after laying an egg every day, so you might have 16 days of laying or maybe 20 days to get 16 eggs. You then got to sit on those eggs and incubate them for 23 days. And they have to be about critical temperature for development, or else those eggs will actually fail. So actually, if you abandon that incubation period, you'll lose your nest. That's really important here in South Florida, because if you get really heavy rains and floods, what happens to those eggs? It's not that they flush away, they flood away, or typically that female gets off that nest and tries to get warm herself, and the eggs go cold. And if that happens for a long time, there's a lot of water around there, they'll fail. Excuse me, but it also means that quail and bobwhite quail as a population can rebound really fast in really good years. And this is one of the important factors of the whole population as a whole. If we don't have lots of little bits where they might survive, or where we reduce their population so much that the probability of just some surviving has gone down, the potential recovery is really hard for them. Does that make sense to people? So you might have a really bad year. Historically, let's say 5,000 years ago, there was a really enormously bad year. 99% of the quail died. There's still 1% there. And in a few years, they could potentially recover back the population levels in areas where they did go extinct. What we're doing now through our island management is that it's really hard for them to actually recover when they go through a really bad trough. Yeah.
Does one breeding cover the whole 12 eggs? Like when she gets fertilized once, does it cover her whole flush of eggs for 12 eggs, or will she have to be bred multiple times to cover 12 eggs?
I'm
just saying, like a chicken, you breed a chicken, then you keep that fertilization good, like 4 eggs.
Yeah.
Before,
yeah. So they probably.
Like if something happens to the rooster, you know, the hen's killed the rooster.
Yeah.
Well.
So I don't know how long, but like sperm retention in actual reproductive tract of female birds is pretty common, and I believe quail can do that. Does anybody know the answer? I don't know the exact answer, but I suspect it may only be one maybe.
Right, let's say if they just met one time, they have to hold 15, do all 12 of eggs, fertilize it. And
the other thing is, in quail, I don't know the answer to this, there might be a few people in here, is what's the parentage of, huh? Google it. Come on, there's some really good people in here. What's the parentage of a quail group? Is it a single father? Yeah, 6 to 7 days for sperm survival.
What we've seen is from the genetics that a single hen can mate as many as 5 different offers.
Yeah,
So they're very promiscuous.
exactly.
Both male and female. And so they're kind of betting that on improving their survival of multiple operators. So it's pretty common.
Yeah,
So what we call angle.
exactly.
Those sexes are highly yeah, so she'll lay more than that at the same time. Pretty complex.
Yeah, it's almost like they do everything to actually get diversity and make sure something happens to get young on. So don't trust one guy, he's not going to be good enough.
Or central South Florida quails, there's a certain habitat where they like to nest in. And I know that quail live and find palmettos, but do they prefer to nest in maybe fence rows and myrtles? Is there something specific that they like to nest in?
Well, there's specific vegetation structure. I wouldn't say specific habitat, if that makes sense. So they'll want to be nesting in slightly denser cover than out where we were in these burns, of course. And the nests I've seen here in South Florida have been in the clumps of andropogon grass, so they're underneath the side of it. I've seen them on the side of palmettos with dense palmetto area with some grass interwoven. And I've also seen them in runner oak as well, when that runner oak is really dense, or just low cover, dense oak. I mean, it seems like there's hardly any sand patch area where they're choosing to nest. It's got some cover. It's probably about a 60 to 75% canopy at least across the top of that nest. The one we found the other day was 100% complete cover. I mean, it was burrowed right into the andropogon clump. Oh yeah. As long as it's like down, and there's usually probably some grass components in there, dragged it in. So it's not what I call a habitat, but it's more like a vegetation structure. Yeah. So talking about habitats here south, so we have flatwoods. It's not the only place quail exists in South Florida. It's quite diverse. They're really generalists in some ways. They're going across a lot of habitat. So we see quail pretty regularly in scrub habitat here along the ridges, and usually the dense oak and the vegetation component is actually in the wet areas of these scrubs, so these perched lake systems, and that's where those quail will be around. Out on the prairie, this is a nice picture of the prairie system, almost no trees. There's quail out in those prairie systems as well. And these are habitats in terms of specifically different habitats. And then obviously flatwoods, where we see quite a lot of quail, and probably the highest densities of quail are in these types of habitats. But I've seen really dense numbers of quail on the edges of scrub ridges as well. But it's sort of, the scrub is probably providing them open habitat, which we've talked about. They're being able to get down to scratch and sand. This is just a picture, I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's lopsided Indian grass. So their ecology, they're really in lots of different habitats. And this is a map of Florida and what it once was. There's no real good maps of Florida in terms of what the vegetation community currently is. I mean, it's on and off. But this was the distribution of what the habitats were. And the pink, I really want you to look at it, it's pink and gray systems here, and probably the edge of this yellow. So these pink systems here are flatwoods. So you can actually see the extent of flatwoods that were through Florida. It was an extensive ecological system here that quail were using, and Florida was the burnt state, and that was a lot of 2-, 3-, 4-year-old fires throughout that whole system. There's records from the studies done at Avon Park bombing range where they showed for the last couple of thousand years the fires were coming really regularly through these areas. And in the last maybe 150 years where they pulled out some big pine, they can actually show those regular fires all the time. And the average fire turn interval out in some of these places is about 2 to 3 years, or even less. So doing a 2 to 3 year burn rotation is really typical of what probably quail evolved in, and that's why it's so important. The scrub lands out here, They didn't burn anywhere near as much as that. I just want to throw that in there. You can't burn scrub every 1 to 2 years. It won't work as well. It typically has a much longer fire return interval, but it doesn't get closed out the same way as what flatwoods do. And it's all about this. This is the term, ecological succession. If you don't do anything, you end up with a climax community. That could be all sorts of things. In our case, it's going to be dense, tall palmettos, interspersed with big oaks, and potentially a pine flatwood system that turns into an oak hammock. That's what's happening without those fires. And I would say people in this room have seen that on properties around here, just observationally over their lifetime. And this is true. And so without these fire, or out something that mimics fire, we're not going to get those habitats that are necessary for quail. Old, overgrown, I'm beating this to death, I know. I want you to do it. Old, overgrown, burn, don't worry about the neighbor, he's got insurance. And then you're going to get a better habitat that's specific for quail. And it's not just quail, it's actually specific for many, many other fire-prone species in Florida. There's a few of them that people might know. You know, butcherbirds, shrikes. Shrikes have been on the same decline in Florida, and they need these open grassland, open pine flatwoods as well. There's some small little brown job birds, quite a lot of sparrows out here that are on the decline, and they need these sorts of habitats. So you're not just helping quail, you're helping a whole community of species. We talked about structure, right? And just in general, we want good structure that ranges from a couple of feet in places, but really it's just a mosaic. It's not all the same. You can't have a 1-inch improved pasture lawn and expect to have quail. That's the point. We can talk in depth about quail structural habitats. There's been 20, 30 years of work done on this in many places, but the critical thing is to actually just have diversity out there, and diversity that's in fairly close proximity to each other. Fire probably used to do that by itself a lot. So you'd always get patches that didn't burn, some that did, some that didn't, and you'd have sort of edge effects. We struggle to mimic that really well because we've had a long time since fires, so we put fires in there, blasted, or it's a big charred black burn, the whole thing's burned, and that's not necessarily good. So you do want recovery points, and some of the classics this one's out of Texas, they're suggesting that you want 5 to 25% sort of taller structured habitat in your area. We get that easily in Florida, in these down here, typically easily. So you're wanting to actually always bring it back from that structure. I'm almost finished. So bunch grasses, little oaks, nesting in, a couple of nests with a male brooding. These are things that I've seen them nesting around and in here. That's a true decline in Florida. And that's, I did this a little bit for you because I split it out, north, south, and central Florida. You can actually see South Florida hasn't gone through quite the absolute extended decline, and that's mainly because there's a lot of habitat left down here. But it never started anywhere near the numbers that were in central Florida. Sorry. I want to end, you can read this later, but I want to end right here. Just one thing, viable populations. You've heard me talk about this a little bit. Little tiny patches or islands of land are great, and they need to be actually converted and helped along and put into the right ecological state. But if it's the only patch for miles and miles and miles and miles around, it's going to be really hard to maintain persistence of a population. Any population, doesn't matter if it's quail or any other wildlife, it could be true of anything. We need to try and continue to protect our larger landscapes and making sure there is connectivity. And that truly is working with big landowners like ranchers, and I'm talking, when I'm saying big, I'm saying 40 acres, 50 acres, thousands of acres better, tens of thousands of acres even better. But connecting our landscape so that we actually allow wildlife to continue to move freely through our state, because If we don't, we're going to lose these species. That's a really big take-home message. And we talked that in the field a little bit. You might do it on 1,500 acres. And I'm going to throw a caveat in there. If you've got 500 individuals, all right? 500 individuals. 250 of them are male, 250 of them are female. That's it. That's how your population starts. You've got a set genetic diversity. There's no more. That's all there is. Who breeds cows out there? All right? If you never bring new genetic stock into that herd, what ends up happening? Anybody going to answer? The figure goes down. Reproductive success goes down. That's probably true of most wildlife species. Once we get down into the hundreds, our genetic diversity is declining. And we're having problems with inbreeding depression, and mutations that maybe maintain in the population don't allow them to be quite as successful as they used to be. And they talked about moving quail around in terms of translocation, and that's probably something that may actually help in the long run. And it can be things like just bringing in a little bit of increased genetic diversity to an area that's already gone through what we would call a bottleneck. Okay? And so there are reasons that these numbers are out there. It's really true that you get down low, you're not going to recover at all easily. And that's why we need to maintain that landscape. I pulled this last one off the web. I didn't know this. I don't know what it is in Florida. People probably got some numbers. But that's what an average hunter will spend just to go and play with quail a year. And that came out of Texas. And it's probably high. Yeah. Is lunch ready? Lunch is ready. You can ask me questions over lunch.